I'd like to now come up to the last decade, and here I'm going to focus on the last 10 years, from 2000 to 2010. And in this section, I'm also going to provide an update on where we are in the current economic cycle. But to start with, what's been happening over the last 10 years? If we go back to the start of the year 2000, there was certainly a lot of concerns in the region at that time. We had just been through a period of major restructuring. BHP had recently closed. We had very weak labour market conditions, and of course there was still concern about the impact of the Y2K vote. As it turned out, worries over Y2K never materialised, and because BHP had a well-planned exit strategy, the economic impact from its closure was quite limited. Nonetheless, the first couple of years of this decade were actually very slow for the region's economy, but we think that was actually more likely to the impact of the introduction of the GST, because when the GST came in, it had quite an impact on construction in the region, and that had a broader economic impact as well. By 2003, though, the economy had entered in what was to become an almost unbroken 5-year period of growth. And during this time, one of the region's key industries, it's the mining industry, was recording strong international demand for its product and also quite good prices. Now, while direct employment in mining is dwarfed by the number of people employed in other areas of the economy, such as manufacturing and some of our service industries, mining has a relatively large multiplier effect. And undoubtedly, the flow-on effect has been one of the contributing factors to the health of the region's economy. The region's economy continued on this extended growth phase until the onset of the GFC in late 2007. But there were no serious underlying structural problems with either the Australian or the hunters' economies. So the effect of the GFC was really to cause a crisis in confidence. Nonetheless, this fall in confidence was enough to change the spending patterns of both householders and businesses within the hunter, and this had the potential to seriously weigh down both the local and the national economies. We had a rapidly deployed stimulus package by the federal government and a willingness amongst local businesses to hold on to their permanent staff and to ride out the downturn. And this certainly mitigated the impact of the GFC on the hunters' labour market, but it also created the building blocks for a quick recovery. And we know now, in hindsight, that the economy was clearly recovering from the GFC in early 2009, and it entered and ended 2010 in strong shape. Despite some weakness that we've got in some of our consumption indicators, business conditions are now generally pretty healthy, and the hunters' labour market remains strong. And just as an example, if we look over the last 10 years, there's been an increase in employment by around 88,000 positions. That's about 8,000 jobs a year on average. So with that statistic, I think the labour force is a good spot to actually start a more detailed analysis. And I'm going to start by looking at employment. Now, some of you will have heard that employment in the region is at near record highs, and you can see on this chart that that's clearly the case. Labour force statistics in general are referred to as lagging indicators, and that's because they tend to follow the business cycle. Sometimes that's by a couple of months and sometimes it's a bit longer. But they still provide a good overview of where the economy is at any particular point in time, and importantly, its direction. The 10-year time series that I've got up on this chart shows that over the last decade, the hunters' economy was generally growing. And you can get that from the sharp increase there in the 10-year trend line. However, there were a couple of weak points. Back in 2001, 2002, where we had a bit of a weakness in the economy there that I think was probably GST related. And then more recently, we had the GFC related slowdown that started in late 2007. But overall, in the last decade, the economy has been producing jobs, and as I said, produced about 88,000 jobs over the last 10 years. So where have these jobs been created? Well, on this next chart, I've plotted the number of people employed by broad industry sector. I've already mentioned that the 1990s was a particularly tough time for the hunter. Australia was in recession, and we had firms that were closing or downsizing in the hunter. But at the same time, we had new industries emerging, and we had some old industries that were reinventing themselves. Now, I'm going to compare two industries on this chart, and the first one is the change of employment in the knowledge-based sector. It's the one here at the top, And this includes jobs that are in the profession, science, technical services, education, health, and a few other areas as well. That gives you an idea of the kind of jobs I'm talking about. And I'm going to compare the change in jobs in this sector with the change in jobs in the goods producing sector. And this includes jobs in mining, agriculture and manufacturing. Now in the mid-1990s, which isn't on this particular chart, the number of people who were employed in the knowledge-based industry was roughly equal to the number of people who were employed in the goods producing industry. But fast forward to the end of 2010, and the number of jobs in this industry was about 60 or 66% or two-thirds higher than jobs in the goods producing sector. I've said before that the shift in employment does not imply a loss of capacity because production techniques have been changing. But there's another point I'd like to make on this chart, and that is that restructuring is a constant ongoing process. And one of the recent and I think very interesting trends that has been occurring has actually been in the goods producing sector. And you can see here that there's been a bit of an upturn. If we just look at these last 3 or 4 years, there's been a bit of an upturn in employment in the goods producing sector. And almost all of that increase in employment has been accounted for by a rise in employment in manufacturing. And you can see that this rise in manufacturing employment started at the end of 2007 and it went right through the GFC. And in fact, the rise in jobs, we had about 29,000 people employed in manufacturing back about this time here. There's been about 10,000 new positions created over that time period. So an addition of about 3,300 jobs on average each year. The anecdotal evidence that we have is that a manufacturing firm in the Hunter now is more likely to be a small to medium enterprise. It's likely to be using high technology and employing highly skilled employees. It's a very different landscape from the one that existed several decades ago. Now, I can't leave the labour force without touching on unemployment. Now, this chart shows unemployment rates over the last 10 years from 2000 to 2010, but just for comparison, I put on unemployment rates in the 1990s. That's that dark line at the top. If you look at the period over the last 10 years, you can see that we had, during the slowdown at the beginning of the decade, we had a bit of a rise in unemployment, and similarly, at the time of the GST, our unemployment rates went up and stayed a little bit higher for a number of months. However, if you compare what's been happening in the region's economy now with what it was like in the 1990s, you can see that the impact, particularly of the GFC on the region's economy, was in fact very modest. The Hunters' resilience during the GFC was related to the strength of the Australian economy, but also the international demand for energy. The restructuring, though, of the 1980s and the 1990s also left us with a more diverse local economy, and this was an economy that was better able to withstand shocks. And just before I leave participation rates, I haven't got a slide, so before I leave the labour force, I'd just like to mention participation rates. For people who haven't come across that term before, the participation rate is the proportion of people in the working age population, which is generally 15 to 64, who are either in work or are looking for work. And in short, it's a general indicator of the size of the available labour pool at any point in time. Usually, participation rates in the Hunter region are quite low. Our rate tended to hover around the 55% mark. Of late, though, our participation rate has been rising quite sharply. And what this means is we've been having quite an influx of new entrants coming into the labour market. Now, this creates upward pressure on unemployment rates, because as new entrants come in, if they don't seek work, then they'll be defined as being unemployed. But this gives you an indication of how strong our labour market is. We've had all of these new entrants, and the fact that our unemployment rates have been actually staying relatively low indicates just how many new jobs have been created in recent years. But there's another important fact to do with participation rates, and that's when we compare the Hunter to New South Wales. There was a time in the 1990s where the Hunter's participation rates was about 9 percentage points lower than the state average. At the end of 2010, and for the first time, our participation rate not only matched the state average, but in fact there were months where it exceeded the state's participation rate. So from going from an average participation rate of around 55%, we've now got an average participation rate that's hovering around 65%. And now a couple of slides on the household sector. I've only got, because of time, a couple of slides I'm going to be showing you here, but the one I'd like to start with deals with consumer confidence. And I've chosen this one to start off because I think the movements in the consumer confidence chart parallel to what's been happening and what we've been recording in consumer spending, at least in broad terms. Now, the chart on the screen shows regional expectations of consumers for the region's economy over two time periods, over the next 12 months and the next 3 months. And there's three key points I'd like to make. One, with the GFC, confidence in the region's economy plummeted, and we know that consumer spending took a similar path, and you can see what happened around this point here. The second point is that post-GFC, there was a sort of euphoria that took over, that obviously people were thinking, well, we dodged that bullet, we got out of that pretty lightly, and confidence then surged to record highs. But the third point that I'd like to make is that we've come back from this euphoric period. Confidence and spending have levelled off. Australia did do well during the GFC, but perhaps after viewing the ongoing economic strife, particularly in southern Europe and in the United States, it might well be that our local consumers have been, and nationally, because there's a similar trend nationally, have been taking the opportunity to prepare for unforeseen circumstances. And they might be doing this by either paying down debt or putting money aside for unforeseen circumstances. In addition, we're probably seeing in this period here where confidence has been easing, a bit of an impact of the post-GFC interest rate rises. And a quick look at two consumer indicators. This one is for new passenger motor vehicles. It's the same data shown though from slightly different perspectives. Firstly, the chart that's on your left-hand side shows the annual change in the number of new motor vehicles registered in the Hunter, and for comparison, New South Wales. The main point here is the Hunter is pretty much following the state trend. The right-hand chart shows the actual number of registrations in the Hunter region only. So what do we get from this information? Well, firstly, you can see that just prior to the GFC, this period here, that consumers were starting on what appears to be a buying spree of new cars. But it didn't last very long, because once the GFC hit, this indicator dived. It has since recovered, but at a level that is well below those levels that had been recorded just prior to the GFC. And it seems to be stabilising around this level, which is about the 10-year average. If we look at new residential building approvals, again, the chart on your left shows, the chart on the annual change is shown on the chart on your left, and actual numbers are on the chart on your right. Now, this indicator fell during the GFC. It recovered temporarily, and you can see now it's just under the decade average, just around here. And this is another indicator that suggests that the post-GFC bounce was pretty short-lived, and the consumers are a bit reluctant to take on large expenditures. The news from retailers prior to Christmas suggests that there was some hesitancy in consumer spending, and what this indicates that this movement we're seeing is probably across the board. What's surprising though with this is that these markers of consumer spending are relatively weak, although the labour market has never been stronger. We've got more pay packets in the Hunter region than we've ever had before. So the implication from this information is firstly that for sellers of consumer products, it's not terrific news because people might be saving rather than spending, and obviously it's an impact on sales income. But for householders, if they're taking the opportunity to shore up their finances, to pay down debt or to put money aside, this is obviously going to afford them greater protection